Welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Welcome atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church is founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, then you are probably in the right place. We meet here every Sunday at noon. So sometimes people think it's a one-off thing. Nope, it's every Sunday for many years. Except next Sunday we are meeting at 1 o'clock. So do try to come at 1 tomorrow. Not next Sunday, June 16th. Yeah. So June 16th we have a special guest coming, Sarah Hayter, who is a founder of a nonprofit that provides support for ex-Muslims. So we're looking forward to that. Everyone is invited. We'll have our little our talk, and then we'll get into a discussion group and have discussion. And that's the way we do it. If you would like to support the church financially, there is a donation jar somewhere here, or you can do it off seattleatheist.church. The donations just go to renting our room. And eventually we have some goals of maybe being at some fairs or whatever, but for now it's just for renting our room. Okay, without further ado, welcome. Please come on up.
Hi everyone. Today I wanted to offer up another compelling article for discussion, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. It was first published in New York Magazine in the issue that came out July 10th, 2017. It has since been expanded into a full-length book with the same title, though I haven't read the book yet. There's also a version of the article on the New York Magazine's website that is fully annotated with many citations in case anyone wants to contest some scientific claim or dismiss anything as mere journalistic sensationalism. Spoiler alert, it's not. This article is a long one, even after I made some cuts for time, so let's just jump right in without any pre-rambling on my part. Though I do want to give my standard caveat that when you hear the first person, that's the author speaking. I don't want to take any credit for these words, because I didn't write them. The article comes in 9 sections, some of which I will skip. So let's get started with Section 1, Doomsday, peering beyond scientific reticence. It is, I promise, worse than you think. If your anxiety about global warming is dominated by fears of sea level rise, you are barely scratching the surface of what terrors are possible, even within the lifetime of a teenager today. And yet the swelling seas and the cities they will drown have so dominated the picture of global warming and so overwhelmed our capacity for climate panic that they have occluded our perception of other threats, many much closer at hand. Rising oceans are bad, in fact very bad, but fleeing the coastline will not be enough. Indeed, absent a significant adjustment to how billions of humans conduct their lives, parts of the earth will likely become close to uninhabitable and other parts horrifically inhospitable as soon as the end of this century. Even when we train our eyes on climate change, we are unable to comprehend its scope. In the winter of 2016, a string of days 60 and 70 degrees warmer than normal baked the North Pole, melting the permafrost that encased Norway's Svalbard seed vault, a global food bank nicknamed Doomsday, designed to ensure that our agriculture survives any catastrophe, and which appeared to have been flooded by climate change less than 10 years after being built. The Doomsday Vault is fine, for now. The structure has been secured, and the seeds are safe. But treating this episode as a parable of impending flooding missed the more important news. Until recently, permafrost was not a major concern of climate scientists because, as the name suggests, it was soil that stayed permanently frozen. But Arctic permafrost contains 1.8 trillion tons of carbon, more than twice as much as is currently suspended in the Earth's atmosphere. When it thaws and is released, that carbon may evaporate as methane, which, when judged on the timescale of a century, is 34 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. When judged on the timescale of 2 decades, it is 86 times more powerful. In other words, we have, trapped in the Arctic permafrost, twice as much carbon as is currently wrecking the atmosphere of the planet. All of it scheduled to be released at a date that keeps getting moved up, partially in the form of a gas that multiplies its warming power 86 times over. Maybe you know that already, but no matter how well informed you are surely not alarmed enough. Over the past decades, our culture has gone apocalyptic with zombie movies and Mad Max dystopias, perhaps the collective result of displaced climate anxiety. And yet, when it comes to contemplating real-world warming dangers, we suffer from an incredible failure of imagination. The reasons for this are many. One reason is the timid language of scientific probabilities, which the climatologist James Hansen once called scientific reticence, in a paper chastising scientists for editing their own observations so conscientiously that they failed to communicate how dire the threat really was. Another reason is the fact that the country is dominated by a group of technocrats who believe any problem can be solved, and an opposing culture that doesn't even see warming as a problem worth addressing. Another problem is the way that climate denialism has made scientists even more cautious in offering speculative warnings. Another problem is the simple speed of the change, and also its slowness, such that we are only now seeing effects of warming from decades past. Another problem is our uncertainty about uncertainty, which the climate writer Naomi Oreskes has suggested stops us from preparing as though anything worse than a median outcome were even possible. Another problem is the way we assume climate change will hit hardest elsewhere and not everywhere. Another problem is the smallness of the numbers, 2 degrees. The largeness of the numbers, 1.8 trillion tons. And the abstractness of the numbers, 400 parts per million. Another problem is the discomfort of considering a problem that is very difficult, if not impossible, to solve. Another problem is the altogether incomprehensible scale of that problem, which amounts to the prospect of our own annihilation. Another problem is simple fear. But aversion arising from fear is a form of denial, too. In between scientific reticence and science fiction is science itself. This article is the result of dozens of interviews and exchanges with climatologists and researchers in related fields and reflects hundreds of scientific papers on the subject of climate change. What follows is not a series of predictions of what will happen. That will be determined, in large part, by the much less certain science of human response. Instead, it is a portrait of our best understanding of where the planet is heading, absent aggressive action. It is unlikely that all of these warming scenarios will be fully realized, largely because the devastation along the way will shake our complacency. But those scenarios, and not the present climate, are the baseline. The present tense of climate change, the destruction we've already baked into our future, is horrifying enough. Most people talk as if Miami and Bangladesh still have a chance of surviving. Most of the scientists I spoke with assume we'll lose them within the century, even if we stop burning fossil fuel in the next decade. 2 degrees of warming used to be considered the threshold of catastrophe. Tens of millions of climate refugees unleashed upon an unprepared world. Now, 2 degrees is our goal, per the Paris Climate Accords, and experts give us only slim odds of hitting it. The UN International Panel on Climate Change issues several reports, often called the gold standard of climate research. The most recent one projects us to hit 4 degrees of warming by the beginning of the next century, should we stay the present course. But that's just a median projection. The upper end of the probability curve runs as high as 8 degrees. And the authors still haven't figured out how to deal with that permafrost melt. The IPCC reports also don't fully account for the albedo effect. Less ice means less reflected sunlight and more absorbed sunlight, hence more warming. It doesn't fully account for more cloud cover, which traps heat, or the dieback of forests and other flora, which extract carbon from the atmosphere. Each of these promises to accelerate warming, and the history of the planet shows that temperatures can shift as much as 5 degrees Celsius within 13 years. The last time the planet was even 4 degrees warmer, the oceans were hundreds of feet higher. The Earth has experienced 5 mass extinctions before the one we are living through now. Each so complete, the slate wiping of the evolutionary record, it functioned as a resetting of the planetary clock. And many climate scientists will tell you they are the best analog for the ecological future we are diving headlong into. Unless you were a teenager, you probably read in your high school textbooks that these extinctions were the result of asteroids. In fact, all but the one that killed the dinosaurs were caused by climate change, produced by greenhouse gas. The most notorious was 252 million years ago. It began when carbon warmed the planet by 5 degrees, accelerated when that warming triggered the release of methane in the Arctic, and ended with 97% of all life on Earth dead. We are currently adding carbon to the atmosphere at a considerably faster rate. By most estimates, at least 10 times faster. The rate is accelerating. This is what Stephen Hawking had in mind when he said in the spring of 2017 that the species needs to colonize other planets in the next century to survive. And what drove Elon Musk in June of 2017 to unveil his plans to build a Mars habitat in 40 to 100 years. These are non-specialists, of course, and probably as inclined to irrational panic as you or I. But the many sober-minded scientists I interviewed over the past several months, the most credentialed and tenured in the field, few of them inclined to alarmism, and many advisors to the IPCC, who nevertheless criticize its conservatism, have quietly reached an apocalyptic conclusion too. No plausible program of emissions reductions alone can prevent climate disaster. Over the past few decades, the term Anthropocene has climbed out of academic discourse and into the popular imagination, a name given to the geologic era we live in now, and a way to signal that it is a new era, defined on the wall chart of deep history by human intervention. One problem with the term is that it implies the conquest of nature, and even echoes the biblical dominion. And however sanguine you might be about the proposition that we have already ravaged the natural world, which we surely have, it is another thing entirely to consider the possibility that we have only provoked it. Engineering first in ignorance, and then in denial, a climate system that will now go to war with us for many centuries, perhaps until it destroys us. Section 2, heat death, the Bahraining of New York. Humans, like all mammals, are heat engines. Surviving means having to continually cool off, like panting dogs. For that, the atmosphere needs to be low enough, the temperature needs to be low enough for the air to act as a kind of refrigerant, drawing heat off the skin so the engine can keep pumping. At 7 degrees of warming, that would become impossible for large portions of the planet's equatorial band, and especially the tropics, where humidity adds to the problem. In the jungles of Costa Rica, for instance, where humidity routinely tops 90%, simply moving around outside when it's over 105 degrees Fahrenheit would be lethal. And the effect would be fast. within a few hours, a human body would be cooked to death from both inside and out. Climate change skeptics point out that the planet has warmed and cooled many times before, but the climate window that has allowed for human life is very narrow, even by the standards of planetary history. At 11 or 12 degrees of warming, more than half of the world's population, as distributed today, would die of direct heat. Things almost certainly won't get that hot this century, though models of unabated emissions do bring us that far eventually. This century, and especially in the tropics, the pain points will pinch much more quickly. The key factor is something called wet bulb temperature, which is a term of measurement as home laboratory kit as it sounds. The heat registered on a thermometer wrapped in a damp sock as it's swung around in the air. Since the moisture evaporates from a sock more quickly in dry air, this single number reflects both heat and humidity. At present, most regions reach a wet bulb maximum of 26 or 27 degrees Celsius. The true red line for habitability is 35 degrees. What is called heat stress comes much sooner. Actually, we're about there already. Since 1980, the planet has experienced a 50-fold increase in the number of places experiencing dangerous or extreme heat. A bigger increase is to come. The 5 warmest summers in Europe since the year 1500 have all occurred since 2002, and soon, the IPCC warns, simply being outdoors that time of year will be unhealthy for much of the globe. Even if we meet the Paris goals of 2 degrees warming, cities like Karachi in Pakistan and Kolkata in India will become close to uninhabitable, annually encountering deadly heat waves like those that crippled them in 2015. At 4 degrees of warming, the deadly European heat wave of 2003, which killed as many as 2,000 people per day, will be a normal summer. At 6 degrees of warming, according to an assessment from the NOAA, summer labor of any kind will become impossible in the lower Mississippi Valley, and everyone in the country east of the Rockies would be under more heat stress than anyone anywhere in the world today. As Joseph Rome has put it in his authoritative primer, Climate Change, What Everyone Needs to Know, heat stress in New York City would exceed that of present-day Bahrain, one of the planet's hottest spots. And the temperature in Bahrain would induce hyperthermia in even sleeping humans. The high-end IPCC estimate, remember, is 2 degrees warmer still. By the end of the century, the World Bank has estimated the coolest months in tropical South America, Africa, and the Pacific are likely to be warmer than the warmest months at the end of the 20th century. Imagine that. Air conditioning can help, but will ultimately only add to the carbon problem. Plus, the climate-controlled malls of the Arab Emirates aside, it is not remotely plausible to wholesale air condition all the hottest parts of the world, many of them also the poorest. And indeed, the crisis will be most dramatic across the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, where in 2015, the heat index registered temperatures as high as 163 degrees Fahrenheit. As soon as several decades from now, the Hajj will become physically impossible for the 2 million Muslims who make the pilgrimage each year. It's not just the Hajj, it's not just Mecca. Heat is already killing us. In the sugarcane region of El Salvador, as much as 1/5 of the population has chronic kidney disease, including over 1/4 of the men, the presumed result of dehydration from working the fields. The same fields they were able to comfortably harvest as recently as 2 decades ago. With dialysis, which is expensive, those with kidney failure can expect to live 5 years. Without it, life expectancy is in the weeks. Of course, heat stress promises to pummel us in places other than our kidneys, too. As I type that sentence, in the California desert in mid-June, it is 121 degrees outside my door. It is not a record high. Section 3, the end of food. praying for cornfields in the tundra. Climates differ and plants vary, but the basic rule for staple cereal crops grown at optimal temperature is that for every degree of warming, yields decline by 10%. Some estimates run as high as 15 or even 17% decline per degree, which means that if the planet is 5 degrees warmer at the end of the century, we may have as many as 50% more people to feed and 50% less grain to give them. And proteins are worse. It takes 16 calories of grain to produce just a single calorie of hamburger meat, butchered from a cow that spent its life polluting the climate with methane farts. Pollyannish plant physiologists will point out that the cereal crop math only applies to those regions already at peak growing temperature. And they're right. Theoretically, a warmer climate will make it easier to grow corn in Greenland. But, as other work has shown, the tropics are already too hot to efficiently grow grain, and those places where grain is produced today are already at optimal growing temperature, which means that even a small warming will push them down the slope of declining productivity. And you can't easily move croplands north a few hundred miles, because yields in places like remote Canada and Russia are limited by the quality of the soil there. It takes many centuries for the planet to produce optimally fertile dirt. Drought might be an even bigger problem than heat, with some of the world's most arable land turning quickly to desert. Precipitation is notoriously hard to model, yet predictions for later this century are basically unanimous. Unprecedented droughts nearly everywhere that food is produced today. By 2080, without dramatic reductions in emissions, Southern Europe will be in a permanent extreme drought, much worse than the American Dust Bowl ever was. The same will be true in Iraq and Syria, and much of the rest of the Middle East, some of the most densely populated parts of Australia, Africa, and South America, and the breadbasket regions of China. None of these places, which today supply much of the world's food, will be reliable sources of any. As for the original Dust Bowl, the droughts of the American plains and Southwest would not just be worse than in the 1930s, according to a 2015 NASA study, but worse than any droughts in 1,000 years. And that includes those that struck between the years 1100 and 1300, which dried up all the rivers east of the Sierra Nevada mountains and may have been responsible for the death of the Anasazi civilization. Remember, we don't live in a world without hunger as it is. Far from it. Most estimates put the number of undernourished at 800 million globally. In case you hadn't heard, the spring of 2017 had already brought an unprecedented quadruple famine in Africa and the Middle East. The UN has warned that separate starvation events in Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen could kill 20 million this year alone. Section 4. Climate plagues. What happens when the bubonic ice melts? Rock, in the right spot, is a record of planetary history. Eras as long as millions of years, flattened by the forces of geological time, into strata with an amplitude of just inches, or even just an inch, or even less. Ice works that way too, as a climate ledger, but it is also frozen history, some of which can be reanimated when unfrozen. There are now, trapped in Arctic ice, diseases that have not circulated in the air for millions of years. In some cases, since before humans were around to encounter them, which means our immune systems would have no idea how to fight back when those prehistoric plagues emerge from the ice. The Arctic also stores terrifying bugs from more recent times. In Alaska, already, researchers have discovered remnants of the 1918 flu that infected as many as 500 million and killed as many as 100 million, about 5% of the world's population, and almost 6 times as many as had died during the First World War, which had just ended. As the BBC reported in May, scientists suspect smallpox and the bubonic plague are trapped in Siberian ice too, and a British history of devastating human sickness left out like egg salad in the Arctic sun. Experts caution that many of these organisms won't actually survive the thaw. and point to the fastidious lab conditions under which they have already reanimated several of them. The experts suggest that the conditions found in those labs are necessary for the return of such ancient plagues. But already last year, a boy was killed and 20 others infected by anthrax, released from retreating permafrost. Wind retreating permafrost exposed the frozen carcass of a reindeer killed by the bacteria at least 75 years earlier. 2,000 present-day reindeer were infected too, carrying and spreading the disease beyond the tundra. What concerns epidemiologists more than ancient diseases are existing scourges relocated, rewired, or even re-evolved by warming. The first effect is geographical. Before the early modern period, when adventuring sailboats accelerated the mixing of people and their bugs, human provinciality was a guard against pandemic. Today, even with globalization and the enormous intermingling of human populations, our ecosystems are mostly stable, but this functions as another limit, But global warming will scramble those ecosystems and help disease trespass those limits as surely as Cortez did. If you don't worry much about dengue or malaria if you're living in Maine or in France. But as the tropics creep northward and mosquitoes migrate with them, you will. You didn't worry much about Zika a couple years ago either. As it happens, Zika may also be a good model of the second worrying effect, disease mutation. One reason you hadn't heard about Zika until recently is that it had been trapped in Uganda. Another is that it did not, until recently, appear to cause birth defects. Scientists still don't entirely understand what happened or what they missed. But there are some things we do know for sure about how climate affects some diseases. Malaria, for instance, thrives in hotter regions, not just because the mosquitoes that carry it do too, but because for every degree increase in temperature, the parasite reproduces 10 times faster. Which is one reason that the World Bank estimates that by 2050, 5.2 billion people will be reckoning with it. Section 5, unbreathable air. A rolling death smog that suffocates millions. This one's a little bit abridged. I almost cut it entirely, but it does touch on some things that are quite close to home here in Seattle. Our lungs need oxygen, but that is only a fraction of what we breathe. The fraction of carbon dioxide is growing. It just crossed 400 parts per million. And high-end estimates extrapolating from current trends suggest that it will hit 1,000 parts per million by 2100. At that concentration, compared to the air we breathe now, human cognitive ability declines by 21%. Already, more than 10,000 people die each day from the small particles emitted from fossil fuel burning. Each year, 350,000 people die from wildfire smoke. In part because climate change has extended forest fire season. In the US, it's increased by 78 days since 1970. By 2050, according to the US Forest Service, wildfires will be twice as destructive as they are today. In some places, the area burned could grow 5-fold. What worries people even more is the effect that would have on emissions, especially when the fires ravage forests arising out of peat. Peatland fires in Indonesia in 1997, for instance, added to the global CO2 release by up to 40%. And more burning only means more warming, which only means more burning. There is also the terrifying possibility that rainforests like the Amazon, which in 2010 suffered its second 100-year drought in the space of 5 years, could dry out enough to become vulnerable to these kinds of devastating rolling forest fires, which would not only expel enormous amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, but also shrink the size of the forest. But it's especially bad because the Amazon alone provides 20% of our oxygen. Section 6, perpetual war, the violence baked into the heat. Climatologists are very careful when talking about Syria. They want you to know that while climate change did produce a drought that contributed to civil war, it's not exactly fair to say that the conflict is the result of warming. Next door, for instance, Lebanon suffered the same crop failures. But researchers have managed to quantify some of the non-obvious relationships between temperature and violence. For every half degree of warming, they say, societies will see between 10 and 20% increases in the likelihood of armed conflict. In climate science, nothing is simple, but the arithmetic is heroic. A planet 5 degrees warmer would have at least half again as many wars as we do today. Overall, social conflict could more than double this century. This is one reason that, as nearly every climate scientist I spoke to pointed out, the US military is obsessed with climate change. The drowning of all American Navy bases by sea level rise is trouble enough, but being the world's policeman is quite a bit harder when the crime rate doubles. Of course, it's not just Syria where climate has contributed to conflict. Some speculate that the elevated level of strife across the Middle East and over the past generation reflects the pressures of global warming. A hypothesis all the more cruel, considering that warming began accelerating when the industrialized world extracted and then burned that region's oil. What accounts for the relationship between climate and conflict? Some of it comes down to agriculture and economics. A lot has to do with forced migration, already at a record high, with at least 65 million displaced people wandering the planet right now. There's also the simple fact of individual irritability. Heat increases municipal crime rates, and swearing on social media, and the likelihood that a major league pitcher coming to the mound after his teammate has been hit by a pitch will hit an opposing batter in retaliation. And the arrival of air conditioning in the developed world in the middle of the past century did little to solve the problem of the summer crime wave. I'm going to skip over section 7 about the permanent economic collapse. I'm going to skip over section 8 about the poisoned oceans. Right to the end, section 9, the great filter. Our present eeriness cannot last. Surely, this blindness will not last. The world we are about to inhabit will not permit it. In a 6-degree warmer world, the Earth's ecosystem will boil with so many natural disasters that we'll just start calling them weather. A constant swarm of out-of-control typhoons and tornadoes and floods and droughts. The planet assaulted regularly with climate events that, not so long ago, destroyed whole civilizations. The strongest hurricanes will come more often, and we'll have to invent new categories with which to describe them. Tornadoes will grow longer and wider and strike much more frequently, and hail rocks will quadruple in size. Humans used to watch the weather to prophesy the future. Going forward, we will see in its wrath the vengeance of the past. Many people perceive climate change as a sort of moral and economic debt, accumulated since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and now come due after several centuries. A helpful perspective in a way, since it's the carbon-burning processes that began in 18th century England that lit the fuse of everything that followed. But more than half of the carbon humanity has exhaled into the atmosphere in its entire history has been emitted in just the past 3 decades. More than half. Since the end of World War II, the figure is 85%, which means that in the length of a single generation, global warming has brought us to the brink of planetary catastrophe, and that the story of the industrial world's kamikaze mission is also the story of a single lifetime. Wally Brooker's, for instance. Wally Brooker is 84 and drives to work at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory across the Hudson every day from the Upper West Side. Like most of those who first raised the alarm, he believes that no amount of emissions reduction alone can meaningfully help avoid disaster. Instead, he puts his faith in carbon capture, untested technology to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which Brooker estimates will cost at least several $1 trillion. And various forms of geoengineer, the catch-all name for a variety of moonshot technologies far-fetched enough that many climate scientists prefer to regard them as dreams or nightmares from science fiction. He's especially focused on what's called the aerosol approach, dispersing so much sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that when it converts to sulfuric acid, it will cloud a fifth of the horizon and reflect back 2% of the sun's rays, buying the planet at least a little wiggle room heat-wise. He says, quote, "Of course, that would make our sunsets very red, would bleach the sky, would make more acid rain, but you have to look at the magnitude of the problem. You got to watch that you don't say the giant problem shouldn't be solved because the solution causes some smaller problems." End quote. He won't be around to see that, he told me, but in your lifetime. Several of the scientists I spoke with proposed global warming as the solution to Fermi's famous paradox, which asks, if the universe is so big, then why haven't we encountered any other intelligent life in it? The answer, they suggested, is that the natural lifespan of a civilization may be only several thousand years, and the natural lifespan of an industrial civilization perhaps only several hundred. In a universe that is many billions of years old, with star systems separated as much by time as by space, civilizations might emerge and develop and burn themselves up simply too fast to ever find one another. Peter Ward, a charismatic paleontologist among those responsible for discovering the planet's mass extinctions were caused by greenhouse gas, calls this the Great Filter. Quote, "Civilizations rise, but there's an environmental filter that causes them to die off again and disappear fairly quickly. If you look at planet Earth, the filtering we've had in the past has been in these mass extinctions." End quote. The mass extinction we are now living through has only just begun. So much more dying is coming. And yet, improbably, Ward is an optimist. So are Brooker and Hansen and many of the other scientists I spoke to. We have not developed much of a religion of meaning around climate change that might comfort us or give us purpose in the face of possible annihilation. But climate scientists have a strange kind of faith. We will find a way to forestall radical warming, they say, because we must. It's not easy to know how much to be reassured by that big certainty, and how much to wonder whether it's another form of delusion. For global warming to work as terrible, of course, someone needs to survive to tell the story. The scientists know that to even meet the Paris goals by 2050, carbon emissions from energy and industry, which are still rising, will have to fall by half each decade. Emissions from land use, deforestation, cow farts, etc., will have to zero out. And we will have to have invented technologies to extract annually twice as much carbon in the atmosphere as the entire planet's plants do now. Nevertheless, by and large, the scientists have an enormous confidence in the ingenuity of humans. A confidence perhaps bolstered by their appreciation for climate change, which is, after all, a human invention too. They point to the Apollo project, the hole in the ozone we patched in the 80s, passing of the fear of mutually assured destruction. Now we've found a way to engineer our own doomsday, and surely we will find a way to engineer our way out of it, one way or another. The planet is not used to being provoked like this, and climate systems designed to give us feedback over centuries or millennia prevent us, even those who may be watching closely, from fully imagining the damage done already to the planet. But when we do truly see the world we've made, they say, we will also find a way to make it livable. For them, the alternative is simply unimaginable. Well, that's the end of the article. I expect you're wondering something along the lines of, so,
yeah,
what do we do now? What is there to do? If that last hopeful sounding bit at the end of the article fell somewhat flat for you, you're not alone. I didn't find it particularly convincing. We'll find a way because we must. Surely we'll find a way to engineer our way out of it. I read a few books in an attempt to learn more about how to think about what life even means in the face of such a catastrophe. I suppose this will be an ongoing project. Each of us has to figure that out for ourselves, of course, but I wanted to share a few thoughts that resonated with me. One of the books is called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene by Roy Scranton. In it, he writes, "The conceptual and existential problems that the Anthropocene poses are precisely those that have always been at the heart of humanistic inquiry. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live? What is truth? What is good?" In the world of the Anthropocene, the question of individual mortality, what does my life mean in the face of death, is universalized and framed in scales that boggle the imagination. Whether we're talking about ethics or politics, ontology or epistemology, confronting the end of the world as we know it dramatically challenges our learned perspectives and ingrained priorities. What does consumer choice mean compared against 100,000 years of ecological catastrophe? What does one life mean in the face of mass death or the collapse of global civilization? How do we make meaningful decisions in the shadow of our inevitable end? These questions have no logical or empirical answers. They cannot be graphed or quantified. They are philosophical problems par excellence. If, as Montaigne, took French, I should know how to pronounce his name, as Montaigne asserted, to philosophize is to learn how to die, then we have entered humanity's more philosophical age. For this is precisely the problem of the Anthropocene. The rub now is that we have to learn to die, not as individuals, but as a civilization. Another of the books, also by Roy Scranton, is called "We're Doomed, Now What?" In it, he writes, "The situation in which we find ourselves today is more dire than any other moment in human history, and we simply cannot wait until we become perfect bodhisattvas or perfect environmentalists before we respond. We must act now, as flawed, failed, flailing selves. At the same time, the situation we find ourselves in is beyond our power to change. The planet will get warmer, the ice caps will melt, the seas will rise. The global, fossil-fueled, consumer capitalist civilization we live in will come to an end." It's precisely in recognizing this paradoxical situation that the insights of Buddhism can help us. If the bad news we must confront is that we're all going to die, then the wisdom that might help us deal with that news arises from the realization that it was going to happen anyway. This self, this existence, this I, was already dying, already dead, already passing from moment to moment in the flux of consciousness, matter, and energy, already nothing more than the trace of a breath. And if I can understand my own self as impermanent, transient, and insubstantial, how much more insubstantial is a civilization, a way of life, a set of habits and structures and prejudices built and believed in and sustained by oh so many insubstantial selves? Breathe in, breathe out. Watch it come, watch it go. Buddhism articulates the riddle posed by human mortality to human consciousness in a way that shows us that the riddle's answer lies not in evading the terrifying void, but accepting the truth that our great ending is merely another iteration of the innumerable endings we live through each day. I found something a little bit more concrete in the book Only Love Remains, Dancing at the Edge of Extinction by Guy McPherson, who is a well-credited expert in these matters, which resonates well with some of the stoicism that I've been reading. When a patient is in stage 4 cancer with days to live, do the doctors keep telling her they're going to save her? Do they still that they still could invent a cure and turn back the clock? No, of course not. That would be lying. A doctor who is a decent human being will be honest and help set up hospice for the patient so she can be comfortable and have a chance to say goodbye to her loved ones in a safe space. In hospice, patients can complete their relationships and be made comfortable so they do not die in agonizing pain or loneliness or filled with the false hope of a miracle cure that is never coming. He says, "We are going extinct and soon. The only way to walk into this strange and alien future is with the analogy of being in hospice. Every one of us, together. Can we imagine nearly 8 billion people saying goodbye to each other in hospice? No longer worrying about our careers, our reputations, our mortgages, or where we will get our water from, or warlords, or pandemics, or the truly mundane parts of life, like doing dishes and taking out the trash and doing laundry, which in the end seem bittersweet. On a person's deathbed, they are either alone or surrounded by those they love. They're not thinking about anything else except the people who meant something to them during their life. After coming to grips with this terminal diagnosis, after receiving and truly understanding this direst of situations, then what? How do we integrate this knowledge into our lives? Who do we become? I strongly suspect that this is still a guy, McPherson talking, that we are the final humans on Earth. In light of this knowledge, will you live more fully each day, each moment? Will you become the best human that you can imagine? Can you imagine that? Will you prioritize your work differently, or your relationships? What is important to you? Who is important to you? Are you acting now as if these things and these beings are important? Are you passionately pursuing a life of excellence? Or are you racing ever faster on the treadmill to which you were born? Are you able to define the meanings of your life? Are you pursuing what you love? Are you doing what you love? Are you loving what you do? Are you doing it well? But what shall I do? Is the constant question he keeps getting asked. Even after all that. Do what is right. Do what you love, and do it well. Perhaps service beyond your own life is important to you. If so, you might be interested in providing the means by which people can be alleviated of their suffering. You might be interested in the notions of hospice, or as Stephen Jenkinson calls it, the death trade. You might be interested in dying wisely, to again quote Jenkinson. You might be interested in helping others do the same. If so, then you have options. You can become educated in hospice, perhaps a more immediate concern. You can pursue knowledge about likely causes of death in your area, so you can be prepared to alleviate mental and emotional suffering for yourself and others. I suspect the ability to remain calm will be important as this ongoing disaster plays out. But make sure you do what you love. After all, you cannot help anybody in the long run if you're not satisfied with your own life. Love starts with you. Listen to the flight attendant. Put on your own mask first. This is not a selfish act, but an act of love for those around you who will need you to be okay, to make sure that they will be okay. At the end of extinction, only love remains. Thank you.